Well, good evening, everybody. It's good to see you back. I want to invite you to come on in. Please stand with us, and we're going to begin our time singing Only Holy God. that we can lift our voices with one another. God, I pray that as we continue to learn about you, to learn about your truth, that we would come and behold how great you truly are. God, help us to worship you even as we listen. And it's in your Son's name that we pray. Amen. I want to invite you to sit down. Go ahead and sit down. And please welcome with me Dr. Terry Mortensen once again. Let's give him a hand.
Well, it's good to see you back here tonight again, and those of you who might be watching on the internet, thank you for tuning in. Tonight we want to talk about origin of species. Was Darwin right? And I want to begin with a statement by the most famous evolutionist in the world, Richard Dawkins from Oxford, England. He said, "It is absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that." Well, I freely admit that I am wicked, saved by the grace of Jesus Christ, but I let my audience decide whether I'm ignorant, stupid, or insane. But I want you to notice something. That is what philosophers call an ad hominem attack. It's an attack against the person rather than an argument against their view. And if you ever hear anybody do that, you know they don't really have an argument to defend their position, so they have to attack their opponent. But we need to have a lesson from that. I'm not going to be attacking Dr. Dawkins' person. I'm going to be disagreeing with his evolutionary ideas, all evolutionists' ideas about the origin of living things. But evolutionists are not stupid. They're not unintelligent. They are wrong. They're very smart. Most evolutionists are way orders of magnitude smarter than me, but they're wrong about the origin of living things, as I hope to show you. Well, the evolutionary view is represented by the evolution tree of life, and this is a chart right out of an evolutionary textbook, and they show you how all the different plants and animals and people are all descended from a common ancestor, the first single-celled creature that popped into existence in the primordial oceans about 3.5 billion years ago. So I just represented it this way, and I like to call this theory the microbe to microbiologist theory for the origin of living things, or more simply, from goo to you via the zoo. Because that's what evolutionists believe. They never put it that way, but that is what they believe. And that view of the origin and the diversity of life is based on two assumptions that control science today. They are the assumptions of what philosophers call naturalism. And there are two basic ideas and assumptions. The first is that nature or matter is all that exists. Now, not every scientist believes that. There are scientists who do believe in God. But most scientists today do their scientific work as if that's true. So they might believe in God on Sunday or Saturday or whenever they're going to their religious holy book, but when they do their science, they do it as if nature is all that exists. And then the second assumption that most scientists use in their scientific work is that everything can and indeed must be explained by three things: time plus chance plus the laws of nature working on matter. If you have those three things, time, enough of it, millions and billions of years, chance, and the laws of nature, the laws of physics and chemistry, the laws of genetics, you can explain the origin of living things. In fact, you can explain the origin of the earth, the origin of rock layers and fossils, the origin of the solar system, the origin of stars and galaxies. You just need enough time, chance, and the laws of nature. Well, those are also the assumptions of atheism. And atheism today controls science. Not all scientists are atheists, but most scientists do their work as if atheism is true. But there are scientists who do not accept that set of assumptions, and they hold to a biblical worldview, and there are two basic assumptions controlling their thinking. The first is that the eternal, good, all-knowing, all-powerful, holy God exists, and he created everything else. Now, that's a very different starting assumption than nature is all that exists. And the second assumption flows out of that one, and that is that this God is not silent. He's a speaking God. He's spoken through one book, the Bible. And the Bible is God's completely truthful eyewitness testimony, which explains the key events in history so that we can correctly interpret the evidence we see today resulting from the creation, origin, and history of the creation. You see, this book was written by human beings, but they were under the influence of the Holy Spirit. And in most cases, they saw the things that they wrote about, but in some cases, they didn't. But God was an eyewitness to every event recorded in the Bible. And he is a God of truth, and he has given us not the answers to all the questions we would like to have. He hasn't told us all the historical facts. He's given us the key historical events and details to understand our world. And when we open up Genesis 1, we read the creation account, and there we learn about the creation of the plants and the animals and man. We're going to talk about man in the next session, but on day 3, God made the land, the dry land, and there's a phrase that appears there 3 times. God created different kinds of plants to reproduce after their kind, according to the seed in them. And then we come to day 5, and God created the sea creatures and the birds to reproduce after their kind. And then we come to day 6, and God uses that phrase again, 10 times in Genesis 1. Now, whenever you see God repeat himself, especially in a short space of a few verses, you should say, aha, I think he's trying to emphasize something. And this phrase emphasizes that God made distinct kinds of creatures to reproduce after their kind. Now, if you remember, those of you who are adults remember back a ways, those of you who are kids, you've probably seen a chart like this in biology. This is the modern taxonomic classification system that was developed by Carol Linnaeus, the great Swedish scientist who was a Bible-believing Christian and a creationist. Initially, as he developed this, he thought that the original created kinds were the same as what he called species. That was probably because he was reading a Latin Bible, and the Latin Bible translated the Hebrew word in Genesis 1 with the Latin word species. But as he collected more data, information, as people sent him samples of other creatures, later in his life he decided that the created kinds were probably at the level of what he called genus. But creation scientists have been doing research on this question. What were the original created kinds? And as a result of their research, we think that it's definitely not the species, and probably not in most cases genus, but in most cases it's at the level of family. So you could have new species form within a created kind, but that's not evolution, that's just variation within a kind. And so, for example, you have these 2 birds that our modern scientists classify as being not only different species, but different genus. They're in the same family, and they can reproduce. And so can a turkey and a chicken. And so can a bison and a cow, or a buffalo and a cow. And you go to South Dakota, and you can have a beefalo burger at a restaurant. We don't know what the first dog looked like, but creationists and evolutionists actually agree that the first dogs were something like a gray wolf. And in the genetic code of those first dogs was all the genetic information to eventually produce all the different wild dogs and domestic dogs. That's the dog kind. We don't know what the first cats looked like, but they had the genetic information to eventually produce all the wild cats and all the domestic cats and even some really big cats. But that's the cat kind. Now, I've noticed something. Cats have whiskers and hair and 4 legs and ears and tails, and dogs have whiskers and hair and 4 legs and tails. but you have never seen a dat or a cog. That's because cats are cats and dogs are dogs. We don't know what the first elephant were, but they had the genetic information to eventually produce the woolly mammoth, the mastodon, the African elephant, the Asian elephant, different amounts of hair, different size humps on the backs of their heads, different size ears, different size tusks, but they're all elephants. We don't know what the first bears looked like, but they eventually produced the black bear, the brown bear, the polar bear, the panda bear. We don't know what the first horse looked like, but it was a horse, and it eventually produced the great Clydesdale and the Shetland pony and the zebra and the donkey and even some little horses like I saw at the Cincinnati airport not too long ago. And then some really bizarre horses like the zebrula. Or at our Ark encounter, we have a Zorse and a Zonkey. That's the horse kind. And we see the same thing in the plant world. Although plant creationists who are experts on plants think that maybe the created kind of plants might even be at the order level, above the family level. But you've got lots of different varieties of apples and pine trees and corn, and you've got the cherry and the plum kind. And just this week, I've been learning from Brent Jackson that there's a lot more in that kind than that variety. And so he informed me that the nectarine and the peach and the apricot can all work together in that kind, and they can produce all kinds of exciting combinations. So that's the plum kind. But you will never find a banana melon in the grocery store because those are different kinds of plants. And of course, God made mankind, but he didn't make all those people. He made Adam and Eve, and in the genetic information of Adam and Eve was all the potential to produce that variety. We'll talk about that in the next session. But then we come to Genesis 6, and there we see that same phrase again. God told Noah to take 2 of every kind of land animal and bird onto the ark. And we'll talk about the created kinds tomorrow night when we talk about Noah's flood and whether they could fit all the animals in the ark. But from these statements, we have what I like to call the creation forest of life in contrast to the evolution tree of life. And so each of the trees is a different kind of creature. So one of those is the alligator kind, one is the dog kind, one is the chicken kind, one is mankind. And in the 1600 years leading up to the flood, they produced variety within their kind, represented by the branches, but one kind didn't change into another kind. And then Noah took 2 of every kind of land, animal, and bird onto the ark. They came off the ark. They had more time to produce variety within their kind, but the trees stay distinct in the forest. One kind doesn't change into another kind. So 2 different ways of looking at the origin and history of life. And those really are the only 2 views. Some people try to combine them, but either everything is related to a common ancestor or it's not. And if it's not, you've got separate creations. And evolutionists don't believe there were separate evolutions of every kind. So we want to look at this and see which view really fits the facts. And before we do, we need to make sure we're clear on what the facts are. The facts are the living creatures, the DNA, the fossils. Everybody has those. Creationists and evolutionists are studying the same creatures, the same fossils, the same DNA. But if you start with naturalistic assumptions and you try to explain the origin of these things, you're going to come up with an evolutionary story. Darwin was using those naturalistic assumptions. Nature is all that exists. Everything can be explained by time and chance and the laws of nature. You won't find those statements in his book, but any attentive reader will realize that's exactly the way he was reasoning. But creation scientists use biblical assumptions. They take the eyewitness testimony of the Creator and they go out and look at the very same living creatures, fossils, and DNA, and they see all kinds of evidence confirming creation. So we want to look at that. But before we do, we need to define an important word, and that is the word evolution. Because evolutionists like to say evolution is change. In fact, I have an evolution textbook at home, and it says just that. Evolution is change, period. Well, evolution is change, but it's a certain kind of change. I'm changing. I don't look exactly like I did when I was 18 years old, although I'm quite well preserved. Thank you very much. But I have fat cells where I didn't used to have them, and I don't have hair where I used to have it. I am changing, but I am not evolving. I am not on the way to becoming Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'm on the way down, not on the way up. So that's not evolution. Evolution is a certain kind of change. I call it vertical change, from one kind of creature into a completely different kind of creature. So the first creatures were single-celled creatures that popped into existence by chance from non-living matter. And then, according to the evolutionists, it was about 1 billion years of reproducing just single-celled creatures before the first microscopic multi-celled creature came into existence by chance. And then it was several 100 million years before those multi-celled creatures evolved somehow into the first fish. And then the fish diversified over millions of years, and eventually one of those fish walked out onto the land for a little bit and said, hey, it's really kind of nice here. And that eventually became the first amphibian. And then the amphibians diversified, and eventually one of them became the first reptile. And the reptiles eventually evolved into birds and into mammals, and one of those mammals eventually led to us. Well, creationists believe in change, but we believe in horizontal change. So God supernaturally created different kinds of creatures, more than 7 kinds, I'm just illustrating here. And he built into those original created kinds the genetic information to produce lots of variety within their kind, but not to change into a different kind. Now, here's the problem. Evolutionists are constantly giving us examples in textbooks, on TV programs, of variation within a kind. You see, this dog has a longer snout than this dog over here. See, that's evolution. No, that's not evolution. That's dogs. That's creation. This is evolution. And what I'm going to attempt to convince you of, if you're not already, that this is not only contrary to the Bible, this is contrary to the real scientific evidence. I want to show you that the evolutionists are confusing us. Here's a science magazine, Discover magazine, cover story, Testing Darwin. Scientists at Michigan State University prove evolution works. And you open up the article, and there's a full page of pictures of these animals. And in big, bold font, they say, Darwin cited the diversity of dogs as an example of accelerated evolution. Well, let me ask a question. What are all those creatures? Dogs. Dogs changing into dogs is not evolution. That's dogs. Well, on the next page, they've got a picture of these birds. They're called Darwin's finches. Darwin studied these on the Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador on his famous 5-year voyage. And he noted that they were different colors. They're really small little birds. And he noted that they had different sized beaks. And he noted that the big beak finches ate big hard seeds, and the little beak finches ate small soft seeds. And so this article says in big, bold font, finches played a central role in Darwin's thinking about the evolutionary process of natural selection. But what are all those creatures? Well, they're not just birds, they're a certain kind of bird. They're finches. Finches turning into finches is not evolution. Okay, now some of them had bigger beaks than others. But I've already tonight been doing scientific observations of this audience, and I've noticed that some of you have bigger beaks than others. And I've been wondering, where you are on the evolution. No, that's ridiculous. Those are finches. But now we've got another subtle problem here. The evolutionary process of natural selection. So if they can convince you that natural selection happens, they've proven evolution. What I'm going to show you is that natural selection is actually the opposite of evolution. Well, let's look at this and first think about the fossil record. Does it confirm creation or evolution? And the fossil record, of course, is in the rocks of the earth, as we see beautifully in the Grand Canyon, but they're all over the earth. They're under the loam soil of this valley. They're on every continent. And evolutionists use charts something like this to picture that geological record and the fossils in those rock layers. There is a general pattern, but it's not nearly as nice and tidy as this picture would indicate. And there are sea creatures all the way through the fossil record. Well, here's a chart from Scientific American, a leading science magazine, showing mammal evolution. And up at the top, you've got the flying mammals, the swimming mammals, and the land mammals. And this chart shows you that they're all related to a common ancestor. And sometimes they have a name and a picture. Sometimes they have no name and no picture. And they don't have a name or a picture for what was the first mammal, which evolved from a non-mammal. But my question is, do they have fossil evidence for the dotted blue lines? Well, the article doesn't tell you. So I'm going to call in as my expert witness the late Dr. Stephen Jay Gould at Harvard University. He was one of America's most famous evolutionists. He was an atheist Jew until his death. But he was an expert on fossils, which I'm not an expert on. He said this: the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. And it's that fact that led him, along with Niles Eldredge at the University of Chicago, to advance the idea of very rapid evolution in small populations, a theory they called punctuated equilibrium. So they rejected the gradualistic theory of evolution. Well, let's go back to that chart from Scientific American, and you can see that I erased the dotted blue lines because Dr. Gould says we don't have fossil evidence for the branches. But we've got to do something else to this chart because the blue bars are on the page of this magazine. They're not in the fossil record. It's the creatures up at the top that are in the fossil record. And as far down in the fossil record as you go, whenever you find a kangaroo, guess what it looks like? 100% kangaroo. As far down in the fossil record that you find a bat, guess what it looks like? 100% bat. So it's cheating to bend those blue bars towards the middle. So I'm going to straighten those so we can see the fossil evidence clearly. And that looks like different kinds of creatures have always been different kinds of creatures. In the article I quoted from Dr. Gould, he said there are two characteristics of the fossil record: abrupt appearance and stasis. That is, the first time that a creature appears in the lowest rock layer, it appears fully formed, fully recognizable, and then as we come up through the rock layers, that creature basically stays the same. Oh, it might have a longer snout or a shorter snout, longer legs or shorter legs, but it's the same kind of creature. Well, abrupt appearance and stasis is just another way of saying what God said: creation after their kind. I want to show you this stasis. Here is a dragonfly in a rock supposedly 200 million years old. Looks exactly like a dragonfly today. Here's an ant in amber, supposedly 135 million years old. Here's a nautilus in a rock supposedly 114 million years old. It looks just like a nautilus swimming in the oceans today. And nobody would have trouble identifying this creature in the fossil record. Hasn't changed in 50 million years. Well, a lot more could be said about the fossil record, but the more that we look, the more we can conclude that the evolutionary tree does not fit the fossil record. It's not just that they have a few missing links, all the links are missing between different kinds of creatures. So let's consider the study of living creatures. Do they confirm evolution or creation? There's not an evolutionist on the face of this planet who would come up to this scene on a beach in Florida and say, "Isn't it amazing what time and chance and the laws of nature washed up on the shore last night?" They would all know this is the result of creative intelligence. There's information there. Not only information in the words, "Thank you, Jesus," but information in the sand art of Jesus on the cross. There's information, actually Bible verses, in the little placards that are stuck in the sand. And then there's information implied by the lights stuck in the sand that are connected to electrical wires back to the hotel. That's all built on information. Werner Gitt is a German scientist. He's a retired director and professor at the Federal Institute of Physics and Technology in Germany. He's a wonderful Bible-believing young earth creationist, and he's an expert on information theory. In his book, "In the Beginning Was Information," he said, "There is no known law of nature, no known process, and no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter." Now, you're reading matter up there on the screen, but there's nothing in the material properties of that screen that's produced that information. It's just picking up light from the projector, wherever that is, but there's nothing in the electronics of the projector that produced that information. It's just picking up a signal from my computer. But there's nothing inside my computer that produced that information. I typed on my computer to make the images of those English letters and words. Well, how did I know what keys to push? Well, I was looking at Dr. Gitt's book. Well, how did the information get in his book? Well, you know, it was an explosion in a paper and ink factory. No, that information came from Dr. Gitt's mind. He typed a manuscript, it went to the printer and became the book. Information always comes from a mind. Very pretty clouds. They're the result of time and chance and the laws of nature. Wind blowing water molecules and dust particles around, they're pretty, but they don't really convey any information. But there's no evolutionist who believes those clouds are the result of time and chance and the laws of nature. They're the result of a really smart pilot who knows how to spell with the rear end of his airplane, and some really smart chemists who know how to make a smoke come out that will hang there long enough so you can read the word. Here's some pretty rocks. They're the result of time and chance and the laws of nature. Wind and water beating against the rocks, but there's no evolutionist that believes those rocks are the result of time and chance and the laws of nature. Here's some interesting things. I have never seen them come into existence, but I know they're the result of a tornado blowing through a junkyard. No, I'm not that stupid. But those things are simple compared to the simplest living things. That is not the simplest living thing, but it is a microscopic insect called a midge. And it has complex eyes, a compound mouth structure. It's got those antenna-like features, those hair-like features. There's nothing simple about this guy. And if we studied him at the level of his DNA, he is mind-bogglingly complex. And unlike those things, this guy and his wife can have babies. And that's a whole nother complicated system based on genetic information. Well, how do those things come into existence? Well, it's as a result of the DNA molecule. A molecule that is in virtually every cell of your and my body, and in the cells of every plant and animal. And just as the English language is made up of 26 letters, and you can combine those in different ways to make words and sentences and whole books of information, so there's a biological language represented by 4 letters, C, T, G, and A, and they can be combined in different ways to make biological words, sentences, and whole books of information. It's like the Morse code. If you know the code and you have a rope and some beads and rods, you can spell the word help. You just need to know the code. And if you have a long enough rope and enough beads and rods, you could spell out the whole Bible. But the rope and the beads and the rods are not creating the information. They're only carrying the information in the coded sequence. Well, DNA is like that. It's a mind-bogglingly complex biological language in code that codes the information for making all living things. It codes the information that determined that you would be a boy rather than a girl, that you would have blonde hair rather than black hair, that you would have green eyes rather than blue eyes, that you'd be tall in stature or short. All of that is coded in the DNA. Now, the DNA molecules, the most compact information storage system known to man, it makes our most powerful microcomputer chips look like nothing in comparison. It has been estimated that if you took all of the human DNA that you could fit on the head of a pin, that would be equivalent to 155 million human DNA molecules. They're very, very tiny. And they would carry the amount of information equivalent to a stack of books from the Earth to the Moon 240 times, or a stack of CDs 1,800 kilometers high. Just an enormous amount of information. Well, you know what DNA stands for. It stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. But that's way too difficult to remember. Much easier way, and this will be impossible to translate by my brother in Spanish behind the wall here. Definitely no accident. Because information doesn't come from an accident. It comes from a mind. So how are we going to explain the origin of the first dogs and the first cats and the first horses and the first midge insect and everything else? Well, there's two key questions. The first is, how did the DNA information for the supposed first living microscopic creature come into existence? In 1953, the year I was born, a very famous experiment was done at the University of Chicago. Stanley Miller was a graduate student, and with his professor, they devised this apparatus to simulate the early atmosphere of the Earth. They simulated the chemicals that they thought were in the atmosphere. They simulated a lightning strike, and then they watched to see what would happen. And they produced some amino acids, which are the building blocks of life. They're not life, but they're the building blocks. But they made an equal amount of right-handed and left-handed amino acids. Problem is, in living things, there are only left-handed amino acids. But most of what they produced was worthless tarry goo. They had a trap to collect what they had made because they knew that if they allowed what they made to go back through the system, the same process that created them would destroy them. Well, a lot of people thought they were just on the verge of creating life in the test tube. They weren't even close. Stanley Miller devoted the rest of his life to trying to solve the problem of how the first life came into existence, and he died without any answer. Paul Davies is a world-famous astrobiologist. He is an evolutionist. He said, "How did stupid atoms spontaneously write their own software? Nobody knows. There's no known law of physics able to create information from nothing." That sounds a lot like Dr. Werner Gitt, the German creationist. But we're constantly told by scientists aren't real scientists, they're pseudoscientists. They don't really know what they're talking about. That's just another attack on people rather than an argument. So, how did the first DNA information for the first living creature come into existence? The evolutionists have no idea. After over 70 or 80 years of intense research with millions of research dollars and thousands of scientists, they have no idea. And right there, the theory of evolution is dead. Because if they can't explain how the first living cell came into existence by time and chance and the laws of nature, nothing else is going to come into existence, no other living creature. For the creationists, this question's easy. The infinitely intelligent creator made the first creature and the DNA. Well, let's assume for sake of argument that somehow that first creature did come into existence by chance. Then the question is, how did the DNA information in that first living creature get changed and augmented or added to to produce all the different plants and animals we see in the fossil record and living today. In other words, how do you go from goo to you via the zoo? And the evolutionists have two main mechanisms: natural selection and random mutations. And we'll consider each of these in turn. They're not difficult ideas. First thing I want to say is that natural selection is a fact. All creationists believe in natural selection, although most evolutionists don't realize that because they never read any of our literature. But natural selection is not evolution, as I'm going to show you. Rather, natural selection is a conservative process. It's not a creative process. And the name even tells you this: natural selection. Nature is selecting from what's already there. So if all the animals died and all we had was crocodiles, they could reproduce for trillions of years, and they would never produce a fish, a bird, a mammal, or a human being, because they don't have genetic information for making gills and hair and feathers. Well, here's proof of evolution. Dr. Michael Majerus was a very famous evolutionist in England. He was at Cambridge University, died a few years ago. I pulled this quote out of a lecture, a PowerPoint lecture that he did in Sweden a few years ago. He said, "The peppered moth is perhaps the most visually impacting and easily understood example of Darwinian evolution in action. It should be taught. It is, after all, the proof of evolution." And the bold was on his PowerPoint slide. What's he talking about? Well, he's talking about the peppered moths, or Bistone betullaria, the scientific name. It comes in two forms: the light variety, or peppered, and the dark variety. And the evolutionary story goes this way. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, these moths would sit on the bark of the tree, and the peppered moths were camouflaged, and so the birds ate more of the dark moths. But as the Industrial Revolution was going on and factories were producing pollutants and killing the lichen on the trees and turning the trees darker, pretty soon the light moth was exposed, but the dark moth was camouflaged, and so the birds ate more of those. And the evolutionists say, see, here's evolution. This is the proof of evolution. But it's not evolution, because we had light and dark peppered moths before the Industrial Revolution. We had light and dark peppered moths after the Industrial Revolution. The moths didn't change. It's only the population ratios that changed. Tonight, most of the people in this room have fairly light brown skin. If tomorrow night I speak and most of the audience is African American, that won't be proof of evolution. That'll just be proof of a change in population. This is not evolution. It may be an example of natural selection, although as evolutionists and creationists have looked more carefully into the experiments that were done, it may not even be an example of natural selection, but it's not proof of microbe to microbiologist evolution. You can read more about that on our website. Well, let's look at this a little more with dogs. This is a chart from an evolutionary textbook that I have, and it shows on the outside wild dogs examples, and in the center an example of a domestic dog, and they have those arrows showing that the wild dogs could breed with the domestic dogs. They don't normally, because we keep our dogs in our houses or fenced-in yards, and the wild dogs could breed with each other. They don't normally, either because they don't live next to each other or they like to marry somebody that looks like them. But creationists and evolutionists agree that probably the first dogs were something like a gray wolf. And in the genetic code of those first dogs was all the information to eventually produce a coyote, a dingo, a collie, a bulldog, and eventually a poodle. But you'd probably have to throw in a few thousand mutations to make a poodle. But this is not evolution, because there's been a loss of genetic information. No new genetic information was added to make a poodle. And if all the other dogs died and you only had poodles, you could breed those poodles till the cows come home, and you would never produce a gray wolf, because there's been a loss of genetic information. Well, let's look at this a little more by considering hair length. Now, it's more complicated than this because there's more than one gene controlling hair length, but we're just going to keep it simple to illustrate. Let's say there's a gene for short hair and a gene for long hair, and both mom and dad have that, and sometimes genes do blend together to make a medium effect, in this case, medium length hair. Now, if they have puppies, what will they produce? Well, if they have enough puppies, they'll produce some short-haired puppies because they get the short-haired gene from mom and the short-haired gene from dad. They'll produce some just like themselves. They get the short-haired gene from one parent and the long-haired gene from the other. And they'll produce some long-haired puppies. They get the long-haired gene from both parents. That's not evolution because all the genetic information for short and long hair was in mom and dad. So you have two dogs that come off the ark. They start to reproduce, and they start to follow their nose. There are no fences in the post-flood world, so some of them, they start migrating north up into Europe. And the farther north they go, the colder it gets. And pretty soon, in the winters, the short and medium-length haired dogs, they freeze to death. And the long-haired dogs say, man, it's fantastic up here. And they survive to the spring and have babies, long-haired babies, because they've lost the genetic information for short hair. The opposite happens with the dogs migrating down into Africa. It's getting hotter and hotter, and those long-haired dogs are panting. They can't cool off their system. They die of heat exhaustion. And the short-haired dogs say, man, it's fantastic down here. And they survive and have puppies. And then the dogs that stay in the temperate zones, they continue to produce variety. This is natural selection in action, but it's not evolution. Dogs changing into dogs is dogs. So natural selection can explain the survival of the fittest, but it does not explain the arrival of the fittest, which is the real question. How do you get dogs in the first place? How do you get creatures that have hair from creatures that have no genetic information for making hair? So natural selection in a biblical perspective is the God-designed method of preserving representatives of the original created kinds in a fallen world. God knew that man would sin. He knew that he would judge the creation. And so he built into those original created kinds the ability to produce variety within their kind so that they could adapt to different environments so that he wouldn't have to constantly do miracles to keep the system going. So natural selection cannot explain how you can go from goo to you via the zoo. So what about mutations? Do they supply the new information necessary for evolution? Well, what's a mutation? A mutation is a mistake, some damage to the genetic code. It can happen from radiation, copying mistakes, as the mom and the dad each make a copy of their DNA and then it's joined together. There are copying mistakes. There are built-in systems to correct the mistakes, but they don't catch all the mistakes. So here's an example of a mutation. This is a totally naked rooster. It's not naked because of a naughty little 8-year-old who pulled all the feathers off. It's naked because of a mutation. It couldn't produce feathers. He would not do well in the wild. Here's another example I saw at an alligator preserve in Florida a few years ago. He was in an enclosure all by himself. He had white skin, white fingernails, white eyes, and I read the little sign in his enclosure, and it said he was an albino because of a mutation. He wouldn't do well in the wild. He wouldn't be able to hide from what he wants to eat. He wouldn't be able to hide from what wants to get him. He's protected in the alligator preserve. So those involve a loss of genetic information. But sometimes you have a duplication of genetic information. This Chinese boy was born with 15 fingers and 16 toes. That's not helpful. He had the genetic information for toes and fingers, he just made too many. And doctors did surgery on him, so he has the right number now. Fruit flies have been the object of evolutionary research. They bombard these creatures with radiation to see what kinds of mutations they can produce. And they've produced fruit flies with fringed wings, with little tiny vestigial wings, with no wings at all, with legs growing out of the eyes, extra wings, but no muscles to run those wings, so they get in the way of the wings that work. None of these are an improvement on the fruit fly. If they let them out into the wild, nature would select them out because they're not fit for survival. And they're not changing into something other than a fruit fly. They're just defective, but they survive in the lab for research. So mutations are a fact. All creationists believe in mutations, but mutations nearly always reduce the genetic information. Sometimes they shuffle existing information or duplicate existing information, but they have never been observed to increase functional genetic information to produce new body parts or new body functions that are not in the parents or in that kind of creature. And this is not surprising. If you had a desktop computer and you took the cover off the tower and you had a little 2-year-old Johnny and a box of computer parts here, and you said to Johnny, "Now, Johnny, you can change any part in the computer for any part in the box." And if Johnny could make changes like that, and you never let him take a nap, you never let him go to sleep, you just say, "Johnny, just keep making changes," that would be like a mutation, a blind, directionless, purposeless change. Would he eventually produce a laptop? No. Laptops are the result of creative intelligence. That would never happen. And to change one kind of creature into another by random changes to the genetic code won't change one kind of creature into another. Lee Spetner is a Jewish scientist. He is an expert on mutations. And this book is all about mutations, not by chance, shattering the modern theory of evolution. And in that book, he says, all point mutations that have been studied on the molecular level turn out to reduce the genetic information and not to increase it. So if you had the DNA of an amoeba, it would have all the information for making every aspect or characteristic of an amoeba. But if you took the DNA for an amoeba and you copied it over and over, and every time you copied it, you made a random change to the genetic code, you would never produce horse DNA, because an amoeba does not have information for making hair or legs or a stomach or a head. Horse DNA has that. Well, at this point, evolutionists will often say, okay, we agree most mutations are harmful or neutral, but, they say, there are beneficial mutations. Well, that's true. But now we have another slippery word, the word beneficial. Have you ever heard this? It occurs sometimes in the news. Evolution is happening right before our eyes. Bacteria are developing resistance to antibiotics in the hospital. Anybody ever heard that? Yeah, that's happening, but it's not evolution. Here's an example. H. pylori is a nasty little bacterium that causes ulcers in humans. Scientists are suspecting it might even be a cause of cancer. Doctors have figured out how to kill this creature. They've developed an antibiotic, and so they give the antibiotic to the patient, and it's absorbed through the cell wall of this little bacterium. And by research, the doctors know that bacterium will produce an enzyme that will convert that antibiotic to a poison, and then the poison kills the bacterium. So it's pretty slick. It's basically assisted suicide. But there are mutant H. pyloris, and because they absorb the antibiotic, but because of a mutation, they can't produce the enzyme, so they can't convert that antibiotic into a poison, so they don't die. No enzyme, no poison, no death. They've survived because of a mutation, but it involved a loss of genetic information. So the doctors give the medicine to the patient. It kills off the normal H. pylori. The mutant survives and has babies, and then they got to come up with a different antibiotic. But the mutant is not an improvement on the bacterium, and it's not changing into anything other than H. pylori. Well, the Bible tells us that we know the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now. So in a biblical perspective, we would say that mutations are the God-ordained consequences of his curse on creation because of Adam's sin. So before the fall, in the very good creation, there were no mutations that caused any death or disease or suffering. Man sinned, and that brought death and disease and suffering into the creation. And mutations are one of the ways that God executes his judgment. We have lots and lots of diseases that are the result of mutations. But one day Jesus is coming again, and there won't be any more mutations, no more death, no more sickness. So when we really look carefully at the fossil evidence, at the evidence of living creatures, the evolutionary tree doesn't really have any real evidence that stands up to scrutiny. But what we see fits with what Genesis says. So, in summary, natural selection is a fact, mutations are a fact, but natural selection plus mutations equals molecule to man evolution. No, that's not a fact. That's a myth being taught all over the world as proven scientific fact. It's really a lie. And I say that because regarding the chance origin of the simplest life, information does not come from matter. It comes from a mind. But the evolutionists deny that there's a mind outside the creation. And as far as evolution in the past, there are no indisputable transitional fossils. There's just a handful of highly debatable examples that when creationists really look carefully at them, and even some evolutionists look carefully at them, they're either examples of variation within a kind or, in some cases, misinterpretation, or in some cases, as I'm going to show you in the next lecture, deliberate fraud. As far as evolution happening today, nature doesn't produce any new information. It only shuffles existing information or loses information. And a process that does that cannot explain how you get new information. So the issue is not microevolution versus macroevolution. That's the way creationists used to speak. I even used that language. Now, we believe in micro change, but not macro change. But I don't use that language anymore. We discourage that language because that language plays right into the hands of the evolutionists. Because they say, well, given enough time, those micro changes can become big changes. But they can't, because the issue is not the amount of biological change, just a little bit over a long period of time. The issue is the origin and addition of genetic information. And little bitty changes will not produce new information. Well, so what? Back to Richard Dawkins, who I began with. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Well, for an atheist, that is perfectly consistent thinking, except there is one problem here. If what he says is really true, then he can't trust what he just said, because the thoughts in his head are the result of the DNA that's making his brain formulate those sentences. So he has no way of knowing that that sentence is really true. It's self-destructive, atheism is. But when you think that way, then you can also think like Richard Dawkins thought in a tweet on his Twitter account a few years ago, with respect to those meanings of human that are relevant to the morality of abortion, any fetus is less human than an adult pig. So go ahead and abort the baby. I mean, we slaughter pigs all the time at the slaughterhouses, so what's the difference? If a human being in the womb is less than a pig. We had a black lab. She developed severe diabetes and blindness at the age of 7. We couldn't take it to see her suffering, and we took her to the vet and put her down. But we didn't put my mom down when she developed glaucoma and incurable heart disease, because my mom's made in the image of God. My dog wasn't. This really matters, what we believe about origins. And it matters according to God too, because he says in Romans, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse." Richard Dawkins is a brilliant man, but he is suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. He's a sinful man who's trying to explain the world without God so that he can say there's no right or wrong, and therefore nobody can say anything that he does is wrong. But he can't really live that way. I know I've heard him say things like he almost wishes that Christianity would be more influential in Britain because he doesn't like the influence of Islam. But he can't say Islam is wrong. He can't say that what Adolf Hitler did was wrong, but I know he thinks that was wrong. But he can't say it within his own worldview, because Hitler was just doing what the DNA made him do. And the Muslim terrorists are just doing what the DNA made them do. So we all are accountable before God, because the creation is screaming the Creator. His fingerprints are on everything that he made. And that Creator became a man, the man Jesus of Nazareth. And in the most famous verse in the Bible, he said to Nicodemus, one of the most religious men of his day, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life." And so that Creator who condemns us for suppressing the truth and unrighteousness sent his Son to die in our place so that we could be forgiven for our suppression of truth and for our immorality and our wickedness, and we could be restored to a right relationship with God. So if you're here tonight, or if you're watching on the internet, and you have not personally done business with God, you have not admitted to God that you are a sinner and that you need forgiveness, I urge you to think about what you've heard, because the creation is revealing the Creator. And there is a Creator who is the judge of all the earth, and one day Jesus will come again and he will judge the world, the living and the dead. And only if we have put our trust in him in this life will we be safe on that day of judgment. Well, we've got a lot of resources to help you think about this issue, and I just want to point out a few as we close. The Glass House, Shattering the Myth of Evolution. It has about 25 chapters, each dealing with one of the most popular arguments that evolutionists use to convince the public of evolution in millions of years. It's an easy read. You don't have to have a science degree to understand the arguments. But these are really common arguments. And then in our answers books, they answer the 130 most asked questions. If you can't get anything but one book, I would get the First Answers book, because it answers the 27 most asked questions that I have encountered in every country that I've been in. People ask the same questions. What about dinosaurs? Doesn't carbon-14 prove millions of years? How can you see distant stars in a young universe? And really, couldn't the days of Genesis 1 be long ages? And the flood was probably just a big flood in the Middle East. These are the kinds of questions that people are asking, and you can get answers. We have answers books for the grade school kids. This lecture is available if you want to get it again, watch it again, or share it with somebody else. It's also available, slightly different, but basically covering the same thing. It's on our website, and in Answers TV. And then there's a book out there by Dr. John Sanford. For much of his scientific career as a plant geneticist at Cornell University, he was an evolutionist, but he became a Christian and a creationist. And this is a powerful book in which he argues that the mutations that are going on in living creatures, the mutations are increasing. Scientists know this. And if those mutations would continue, it wouldn't be very many years. I think he estimates if the mutation rate in the human genome continued at the rate it's going, in 30,000 years, humanity would be extinct because our genetic code is deteriorating. That's because of the fall. And this is fatal to the theory of evolution. So if you want something a little more in-depth, or you know somebody who's just got to have something that's really something to chew on scientifically, that would be a great gift to give them. Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson on our staff has written a book, Replacing Darwin. This is a little shortened version of the book because that's an in-depth book. Dr. Jeanson has a PhD from a little-known school called Harvard University in biology. He's brilliant. And this is not a critique of evolution. This is a creationist alternative to evolution. And this is just a shortened version to give you a taste of what he's thinking. Very, very gifted young man. Any book or DVD that you want to combine together and make your own combination, you can save money that way. We've also got a short little booklet, just fits in your shirt pocket. It's written by our geneticist, Dr. Georgia Purdom, and explains what I've been talking about, natural selection and evolution. Also encourage you to think about getting the Answers magazine, beautiful full-color magazine for the whole family with the center section for the really little kids. You also get the digital edition free with the print subscription, and then you can read it on your cell phone or your tablet or whatever. And it's helping to build a biblical worldview about all kinds of topics, not just the creation evolution issue. So you can sign up for that on the book table. And if you do, you can get one DVD free for each year that you subscribe up to 3 years. Our newsletter is free. You can sign up for that on the book tables. We've got a lot more on our website. Articles dealing with the biological origins, also on our answers.tv. And lots of things to learn about this at our museum and our Ark. And I also want to just point out that at the Ark, we are now in our Answer Center down in the basement. We now have a really, really good lab that we've just furnished with the latest lab equipment. And for homeschoolers, we are running this summer now the beginning of 1-week modular lab courses to help homeschoolers get their lab credits in biology and chemistry. So you can find out about that on our website, and you'll be able to enjoy the Ark along with doing that work. So, okay, we're going to take a break and take about 20 minutes or so and come back at 7:30 and talk about human origin.